The Supreme Court has just released a potential landmark decision impacting the future of birthright citizenship in the U.S. The justices were asked to roll back nationwide injunctions against the president's attempt to redefine the 14th Amendment, which states that anyone born in the U.S. is automatically a U.S. citizen, regardless of their parents' citizenship status. It's been in place for more than 150 years. But now, in a 6-3 split, the conservative majority ruled that President Trump can move forward with implementing his birthright citizenship change, except for those who brought the case, the 22 states and a group of pregnant immigrant women.
Okay, so something big is happening in Washington, and it's not what Trump expected when he came back to power with a Republican Congress supposedly ready to do his bidding and carry out his every wish. Members of his own party are turning on him. They're joining with Democrats to block his executive orders. They're using the power of the purse to defund his agenda item by item. They're refusing to give him money to implement the policies he signed with such fanfare in those televised ceremonies where he held up the orders for the cameras. This is a rebellion happening right under his nose, and it's crippling his ability to govern the way he wants to govern through unilateral executive action. We're talking about more than a dozen executive orders that have been blocked by courts across the country, and now Congress is piling on by cutting funding for even more of them through the appropriations process. The Northern Border Duties Order blocked and defunded, the Mineral Production Order neutered through spending cuts, tariffs on China and Venezuela held up in court with injunctions, agency dismantling plans paused by judges issuing nationwide injunctions, and now Congress is saying we're not giving you the money to do the rest of what you want to do either, so good luck implementing anything without resources. This is checks and balances coming back to life in a way we haven't seen in a very long time, and Trump is absolutely furious about it because it's destroying his vision of how his second term was supposed to go. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Who brought that case? So it's not directly getting at the 14th Amendment here, but this will have a nationwide impact. Let's go ahead and bring in our Devin Dwyer, ABC's senior Washington reporter, who's been following the Supreme Court on this. Devin, it's not as straightforward as I think a lot of people were perhaps expecting or hoping to hear. So break down what this actually means.
Well, this was a big surprise, Whit, and this is coming from the youngest conservative justice on the Supreme Court, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, 6-3, as you said, in a big win for Donald Trump, saying he can move forward with that executive order that he issued on day one, changing the definition of citizenship in this country. Practically speaking, it means the president can, in the next 30 days, begin to develop guidelines for how he would implement that. It does not mean, however, Whit, that this executive order is free from future legal challenge. Legal cases in 3 different districts will continue on the merits.
Think about what this means for his presidency and his ability to push through the agenda he promised his voters. Trump came into his second term thinking he had learned from the mistakes of the first one. He thought he knew how to use executive power more effectively this time around without getting bogged down in congressional negotiations and legislative processes. He thought he could just sign orders and make things happen through sheer force of will without having to deal with Congress or courts getting in his way and slowing everything down. He staffed his administration with loyalists who would carry out his wishes without question or hesitation. He had a Republican House and Senate that were supposed to rubber stamp everything he wanted and give him whatever he needed. And yet here we are with his agenda being dismantled piece by a combination of judicial rulings, striking down his orders, and congressional defiance, refusing to fund their implementation. The courts have blocked roughly 2/3 of his early executive orders, including many that mirrored the Project 2025 blueprint that his allies spent years putting together as a roadmap for his second term. And now his own party in Congress is using appropriations bills to kill orders that the courts haven't gotten to yet. They're refusing to fund implementation of policies they don't support. They're strangling his agenda in the cradle before it can even take effect and show results. And here's what makes this particularly devastating for Trump and his political standing. He only has a slim majority in the House of Representatives. We've been talking about how Republicans nearly lost that Texas special election because they couldn't stop fighting among themselves and split the vote between multiple candidates. That same dysfunction and inability to unite is now showing up in how Congress handles Trump's executive orders and spending priorities. He doesn't have the votes to ram through whatever he wants without opposition. He needs almost every single Republican to stay in line on every vote, and clearly that's not happening on issue after issue. Some Republicans are peeling off to join Democrats in blocking specific orders they don't like or think are bad policy. Some are using the appropriations process to quietly defund things without having to take a direct public vote against the president that might anger his base. The coalition is fracturing in ways that make it impossible for Trump to govern through executive action alone the way he clearly wants to and plan to. So we're going to dig into exactly what's being blocked, why Republicans are rebelling against their own president, and what this means for the rest of Trump's second term and his ability to deliver on his promises. Because this is a major shift in the power dynamics in Washington, and everyone needs to understand what's happening and why it matters. Stick around. All right, so let's really get into what's happening with these executive orders, because the scope of what's being blocked is genuinely remarkable and represents a real crisis for Trump's ability to implement his agenda the way he envisioned. By December 2025, more than 12 of Trump's executive orders have been blocked by federal courts through injunctions and other legal mechanisms that prevent their implementation. 12 separate orders stopped cold by judges. That's not a couple of minor setbacks on peripheral issues that nobody really cares about. That's a systematic judicial rejection of core elements of his second-term agenda that he campaigned on and that his supporters expect him to deliver. And the orders being blocked aren't obscure technical regulatory matters. They're major policy initiatives that form the backbone of what Trump promised to do. Tariffs on China and Venezuela have been challenged and held up in legal limbo. Border enforcement measures have been blocked by judges finding constitutional and statutory problems. Agency restructuring plans have been paused while courts consider their legality. Judges across the country have looked at what Trump is trying to do and said, no, you don't have the authority to do that unilaterally, or no, you're not following the proper procedures required by law, or no, this violates constitutional rights that we're obligated to protect. Let's look at some specific examples to understand the scope of what's happening here. Executive Order 1-4226, signed on March 2nd, 2025, dealt with northern border duties related to combating illicit drugs coming into the country. This was part of Trump's broader effort to crack down on drug trafficking and illegal immigration at both the northern and southern borders, which was a major campaign promise. But Congress looked at this order and simply refused to provide the appropriations necessary to implement it. They just said, no, we're not funding that initiative, we don't support it. And without funding, an executive order is ultimately just a piece of paper sitting on someone's desk. It doesn't matter what the president signs in the Oval Office if there's no money to actually carry out what he's ordering agencies to do. Agencies can't hire staff without funding. They can't buy equipment without funding. They can't implement new programs without resources to support them. Executive Order 1-4241 dealt with mineral production and domestic mining, part of Trump's push to expand resource extraction and reduce dependence on foreign sources for critical minerals. Same story with that one. Congress used spending bills to effectively neuter the order by denying the funds needed to implement it in any meaningful way. At least 5 major executive orders have been killed or crippled through the appropriations process this way, separate from and in addition to the dozen plus that courts have blocked through injunctions. This is exactly what the Constitution envisions when it talks about checks and balances between the branches of government, but it's also exactly what Trump thought he could avoid this time around by being more aggressive and strategic about using executive power in his second term. He thought he had figured out how to work around these constraints. As legal scholars at the University of Chicago have explained in their analysis, Congress can indirectly frustrate executive orders by refusing to use its spending powers to fund implementation of policies it doesn't support. The president can order agencies to do things all day long, but agencies need money to actually do those things in the real world. They need staff to be hired and paid. They need equipment to be purchased. They need resources allocated to new programs. If Congress says we're not appropriating funds for that purpose, the order becomes effectively unenforceable regardless of what the president wants or how loudly he demands action. This is a fundamental check on executive power that exists in our constitutional system precisely to prevent presidents from becoming too powerful and governing without legislative input. And right now, Congress is using that power against Trump in ways that are genuinely constraining what he can accomplish through executive action alone. The judicial pushback has been even more dramatic in some ways because it involves courts directly telling the president that his orders are illegal or unconstitutional and cannot be implemented at all. About 2/3 of Trump's early executive orders, the ones that closely mirrored the Project 2025 blueprint his allies created as a roadmap for conservative governance, have faced serious legal challenges in federal courts, and many have been blocked at least temporarily through preliminary injunctions while litigation continues. Judges have issued nationwide injunctions halting implementation of order after order across the full range of Trump's policy priorities. They found that Trump exceeded his constitutional authority by acting without proper congressional authorization. They found that proper administrative procedures weren't followed as required by law. They found that the orders violated statutory requirements or constitutional protections for individuals and groups affected by the policies. This is a level of judicial resistance to presidential action that even Trump's first term didn't see, at least not this quickly and this comprehensively across so many different policy areas. The courts are absolutely not rubber stamping his agenda the way some feared they might. They're scrutinizing every order carefully under existing law, and they're saying no a lot more often than they're saying yes. Now, you might think that with a Republican Congress, Trump would at least have backup and support when courts block his orders. You might think congressional Republicans would rally behind their president and find creative ways to work around judicial rulings or pass legislation to authorize what courts said he couldn't do unilaterally. But that's not what's happening at all. Instead, Republicans are adding to Trump's problems by using their own constitutional power to block orders that courts haven't even gotten to yet. This is where the fractured coalition really shows itself in undeniable ways. Trump's slim House majority means he can only afford to lose a handful of Republican votes on anything before he loses the vote entirely, and on issue after issue, he's losing more than a handful of his own party members. Some Republicans genuinely disagree with specific orders on substantive policy grounds and don't want to implement them. Some are worried about the political backlash in their swing districts if they're seen as supporting unpopular Trump initiatives. Some are using their leverage to extract concessions from the administration on other issues they care about. Whatever their individual motivations might be, the result is the same. Trump's agenda is being blocked from multiple directions at once, and there's no clear path to breaking through. The timing of all this congressional rebellion is particularly brutal for Trump because it's happening during a government shutdown that's already creating chaos and political pressure on everyone involved. Shutdowns are always messy and disruptive, but this one is especially complicated because of all the interconnected fights over executive orders and spending priorities and who controls what. Congress is supposed to be passing appropriations bills to fund the government and keep it operating, but every single one of those bills becomes an opportunity for members to defund Trump priorities that they don't like or disagree with. The shutdown creates leverage for people who want to block specific orders because the administration desperately needs their votes to reopen the government and end the crisis. And Trump can't just go around Congress by using emergency powers or creative executive actions because courts and Congress are both pushing back on that approach too, through their respective powers. He's boxed in from multiple directions simultaneously, and his options for breaking out of that box are severely limited by the constitutional structure he's now bumping up against. So let's break this down into what you really need to understand about this power shift and what it means for the rest of Trump's presidency and his ability to accomplish anything significant. Because this is genuinely significant and represents a real change in the dynamics of how Washington is working, or more accurately, not working right now. First point, the combination of judicial blocks and congressional defunding represents a comprehensive rejection of the idea that a president can govern primarily through executive orders without legislative cooperation. Trump's theory of his second term was that he could accomplish his entire agenda primarily through executive action without having to go through the messy process of actually legislating and building coalitions and making compromises with people who disagree with him. The plan was simple in concept: sign orders, implement them through loyal agency heads who wouldn't push back, and present Congress and the courts with fait accompli. They couldn't easily reverse. That theory is being tested against reality, and it's failing spectacularly right now. Courts have blocked more than a dozen orders outright through injunctions. Congress has defunded at least 5 more through the appropriations process. That's approaching 20 major executive actions that Trump signed with great fanfare and media coverage that are now going absolutely nowhere. His pen and phone strategy isn't working because both the judicial branch and the legislative branch are pushing back hard using their own constitutional powers. This matters enormously because it forces Trump to actually work with Congress if he wants to accomplish anything lasting that can't be easily reversed. Executive orders can always be undone by the next president with their own orders. They can be blocked by courts finding legal problems. They can be defunded by Congress refusing to appropriate money. If Trump wants policies that actually stick and survive beyond his presidency, he needs to pass legislation through both chambers. And passing legislation requires building coalitions across the party, making deals with skeptical members, and accepting compromises on things he'd rather not compromise on. All things Trump has shown repeatedly he's not very good at or interested in doing. He'd rather just sign orders, declare victory on social media, and move on to the next thing. But that approach is crashing hard into the reality of how American constitutional government actually works. Second point, Republican rebellion on appropriations is even more politically significant than judicial blocks because it shows the deep fractures within Trump's own coalition that he can't wish away or blame on external enemies. When courts block Trump's orders, he can rage about activist liberal judges and claim the legal system is rigged against him and his supporters. His base will believe him and rally behind him against the judicial deep state. But when his own party in Congress refuses to fund his priorities using their constitutional power of the purse, that's a completely different kind of problem. That's Republicans saying publicly through their votes that we don't support this specific thing you want to do, and we're not going to help you do it. That's members of his own team defecting on recorded votes. That's the coalition that's supposed to be unified behind him, showing cracks that everyone in the country can see clearly. Trump can't really blame this on Democrats because Republicans control both chambers of Congress. He can't blame it on the deep state or career bureaucrats because these are elected Republicans using their constitutional authority to check his power. He has to confront the uncomfortable reality that his party is not as unified behind his agenda as he thought it was or as he needs it to be to govern effectively. The slim House majority makes this problem basically unsolvable for Trump through political pressure or threats alone. He can threaten to primary Republicans who vote against him on key issues, but that threat only goes so far and only works on certain members. Some Republicans are in safe deep red seats where Trump's endorsement doesn't matter much because they'll win their primaries anyway. Some are in swing districts where being seen as too close to Trump on controversial issues is actually a liability with general election voters who will decide their fate. Some have their own political ambitions and their own calculations about what's best for their long-term careers that don't necessarily align with doing whatever Trump wants today. Trump can't fire members of Congress the way he fires executive branch officials who displease him. He has to work with the Congress he has and the members who were elected, and the Congress he has includes enough Republican defectors on enough issues to block significant parts of his agenda whenever they choose to defect. That's the political reality he's facing, and there's no easy way to change it, no matter how much pressure he applies. Third point, this dynamic of Republican dysfunction is feeding directly into Democratic momentum heading into 2026 in ways that compound all the other problems Republicans are facing and make the midterms look increasingly dangerous for them. We've talked about how the Texas special election showed Republican dysfunction at the state level, with vote splitting and infighting nearly handing Democrats a seat. We've talked about how Democrats have been winning races they shouldn't be winning throughout 2025 based on the fundamentals of those districts. Now add congressional Republicans blocking their own president's agenda on vote after vote to the picture, and you have a comprehensive narrative of a party that simply cannot govern effectively even when it controls the White House and both chambers of Congress. That's a devastating political message that Democrats are going to hammer relentlessly. Voters gave Republicans complete control of the federal government. What have they done with that power? Fought among themselves constantly, blocked their own president's orders, and failed to deliver on the agenda they campaigned on and promised voters they would implement. That's not a record that inspires confidence or enthusiasm among anyone. Democrats are going to make this argument over and over through the 2026 campaign cycle. They're going to point to every blocked executive order as evidence that Republicans can't get things done even when they have all the power. They're going to highlight every Republican defection vote as proof that even Trump's own party doesn't really trust him or support his agenda. They're going to contrast Democratic unity on key votes with Republican chaos and infighting. And honestly, they have plenty of evidence to make that case convincingly based on what we're actually seeing happen in real time. The question for voters will be whether they care more about the process dysfunction or about specific policy outcomes that affect their lives. If voters just want things to get done and are frustrated by gridlock, Republican dysfunction could really hurt the party badly. If voters are focused on specific issues where they agree with Trump, regardless of whether he's implementing them successfully, the dysfunction might matter less in their voting decisions. But either way, Democrats have a compelling story to tell, and Republicans are giving them fresh material to work with every single week. Fourth point, this situation connects to the broader constitutional battles we've been tracking around executive power and the structural limits of presidential authority in our system. Trump came into his second term wanting to dramatically expand executive power beyond what previous presidents had claimed. He wanted to assert complete control over executive agencies, fire anyone who displeased him at will, implement major policies through orders rather than legislation, and generally govern in a more unilateral way than any president in modern history. Courts have been pushing back on that expansive theory of presidential power throughout 2025. We've seen rulings on everything from mass federal layoffs to tariffs to agency restructuring that have limited what Trump can do through executive action alone without congressional authorization. Now Congress is pushing back too, using its own constitutional powers over appropriations and legislation to constrain what critics call executive overreach and what Trump calls just doing his job. This is actually how the constitutional system is supposed to work according to basic principles the founders built into our government. They designed 3 separate branches precisely so they would check and balance each other and prevent any single branch from accumulating too much power. For a while over recent decades, it seemed like the executive branch was winning that competition and accumulating more and more power relative to Congress and the courts. Presidents of both parties expanded executive authority incrementally over time, Trump's second term was supposed to dramatically accelerate that trend with aggressive, unprecedented use of executive authority to remake the government. Instead, we're seeing both other branches assert their own powers forcefully and push back against what they view as executive overreach. Whether you like Trump or hate him, whether you support his specific agenda or oppose it, this reassertion of checks and balances is genuinely significant for how our government works now and into the future. It establishes that there are real enforceable limits on presidential power, even when the president has the same party Congress that theoretically should support him. So where does this leave us as we watch these power struggles continue to unfold? We have a president whose agenda is being blocked from multiple directions simultaneously in ways he clearly didn't anticipate. Courts have stopped more than a dozen executive orders cold. Congress has defunded several more through appropriations bills. Republican defectors are joining Democrats on vote after vote to kill priorities the president thought he could implement unilaterally without opposition. The slim House majority that was supposed to enable Trump's agenda is instead preventing significant parts of it because he can't hold his coalition together reliably. Democrats are using all of this chaos to build their case for taking back the House in 2026. And the fundamental power dynamics in Washington are shifting in ways that will constrain not just Trump, but future presidents of either party who might want to govern primarily through executive action rather than legislation. Trump is certainly not powerless. He's still the president of the United States with all the authority and influence that position entails. But he's discovering painfully that there are real limits on what he can accomplish when both courts and Congress are actively resisting his approach to governance. He can rage about it on social media. He can blame everyone from liberal activist judges to Reno Republicans who betrayed him. He can claim the entire system is rigged against him and his supporters. But none of that angry rhetoric changes the fundamental reality that his agenda is being blocked on multiple fronts, and there's no easy path to unblocking it given the constitutional structure he's operating within. The separation of powers that he wanted to steamroll and overwhelm is proving more resilient than he expected or planned for. And every day that passes without successfully implementing his executive orders is another day his presidency looks weaker and his political position looks more vulnerable heading into crucial midterm elections that will determine whether he even has a cooperative Congress for his final 2 years in office. Keep watching, because this power struggle between branches is far from over and the stakes couldn't be higher for everyone involved. Stay tuned.